Good afternoon. Well, is it afternoon? No. Good morning, board members. Welcome to the October 17th webinar. I want to go over the agenda and the goals a little bit. First thing I want to do is because there's a quorum present, this is a public meeting of the board, so we need somebody to chair the meeting. I see that there are at least not yet any members of the executive committee in attendance on the webinar. So I'm going to ask Connie. Oh, Mary Jean just logged in. Okay, so Mary Jean, for the purposes of this public meeting, you will be on record as the chair of the meeting. And if you could just respond to us on your response mechanism. Oh, can you talk? Mary Jean? All right, so she's indicated as being logged on, and she is the chair of record for the meeting. I'd like to briefly go over the agenda. I want you to note one change to the agenda. The 11:10 block is indicated as Ben and Sarah. That's actually going to be Ben and Aaron. So I'm briefly going to go over the goals for today's webinar. Then I'm going to turn it over to Aaron at the for the 11:10 block, and the purpose of that block is to have Aaron paint a picture for you in terms of how the AAW meeting went last week, procedures that were followed, questions that were asked, how input was received, etc., so that you have a flavor for what went on. Then at the 11:30 block, we are going to structure that block exactly to the questions that you asked the AAW and the AAW deliberated on at the meeting. So Sarah has posted a PowerPoint that walks you in a very linear manner through each question. And to the extent that there was any discernible trend in terms of the feedback on those questions, she notes that. And then at the end, we're going to loop back and provide an initial staff recommendation in those areas where we think one is warranted. There's actually a couple of areas where we think the lack of a discernible trend and need for additional information probably warrants further discussion. And then I want to hone in on the 3 questions that were sent to you. That's really the goal of this meeting, okay? We want to answer these 3 questions. First, what clarifying questions do you have about the staff options that were presented? Number 2, do you understand the staff recommendation, and do you have any concern about it or additional need for clarification? And then 3, I would say 3 is the most important. We want to put a motion before you at the November meeting that reflects these recommendations or whatever modifications you so desire. We need to come out of this call with a clear understanding of what you would need to be comfortable with such a motion. That's the goal of today's call. So I'm going to turn it over now to Aaron. Aaron, can you give everybody a sense for what transpired at the AAW meeting?
Yeah, so this is Aaron, Communications Director for the State Board. On Wednesday, October 10th, SBE and OSPI staff hosted the first meeting of the Achievement and Accountability Work Group. The meeting, which was held from 10 to 3 in Renton at the PSESD, was well attended with 21 out of the 22 invited stakeholders in attendance. We began the morning with an overview of the work group's goals and the directives from the State Board and OSPI steering committees, as well as a discussion of meeting norms, courtesy of Ben and Alan Burke. Richard Wenning then followed with a presentation on student growth measures, and then Sarah Rich provided her overview of key decision points for the work group related to indicators. After lunch, staff facilitated several small group discussions where members were provided time to engage on each of the performance indicator questions. And then in the last hour, we came back together as a whole group to discuss and share some of the findings. And Richard Wenning was also helpful in sharing his insights during this time. So SBE and OSBI staff were very committed to holding a well-organized and highly efficient work session, and the feedback we have received both during the meeting and afterwards via survey indicates that we did fairly well in meeting this goal. In addition to several direct members' compliments to the staff, we also confirmed AAW members' positive feedback to several key questions around facilitation, the opportunity for everyone to participate, and the availability of information so that the members could participate in the meeting. And the feedback was all positive. We asked a fourth question, which was, did everyone have equal time for discussion? And though we didn't get any negative responses here, the majority of the responses were neutral. We had small group and large group discussions going on, and we did maximize opportunities for individual input, and we even increased time for certain questions. However, some questions really deserved more discussion and more time that we had, and Sarah will address some of those points in her PowerPoint. So at the close of the October 10th meeting, staff reiterated the next steps for the AAW, beginning with the development of a feedback report that captures members' discussions. The feedback report is in its final stages and will be sent out to AAW members and board members soon. Our feedback report includes a list of the 4 board questions directed to the AAW, an executive summary of AAW members' input on those key questions, and a more thorough summary of members' comments. We are also including additional comments that might not be pertinent to the 4 questions, but may come up later in future AAW meetings or that were expressed during the meeting. So AAW members will have approximately a week to review and offer suggestions for revisions to the feedback report, and then we will include the final feedback report in the November board packet. So now we're going to transition into our presentation where Sarah will highlight the questions posed to the AAW, the input received by members, and staff recommendations.
And Aaron, let's prep them for how it's going to play out on the back end of Sarah's presentation. So we're going to do the Sarah presentation, then we're going to take questions from the members at that point. Okay, then we're going to take a break, a 5-minute break, we'll say, in which they'll give us some time to pull these questions together, and then we will have dedicated time for board discussion on the content that you've been presented. Okay, so let's go with Sarah at this point.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, thanks, Aaron. I won't belabor this first slide, which basically restates what Ben has already said, except to say that what I'm going to do is walk you through in a series of slides the choices that we presented to the AAW for their feedback, and then the following slide will highlight what the AAW's recommendations were. And then we're holding off on staff recommendations, but you'll see these slides again with staff recommendations layered on top of those, and Ben will go over those with you after the break. And so I will stop at the end of my presentation. Webinars aren't exactly as smooth as in-person meetings, so it'll feel artificial, but I will stop at the end of my presentation and see if there are any clarifying questions. You can either chat those in, or perhaps we can unmute you if you're on the phone at that point. Okay, so first of all, let me orient you to this slide. On the left-hand side, you can see a map of the presentation, and that's because so many of these big ideas are overlapping. We've tried to separate them out as much as possible to get clear input, and we found we were getting lost in the PowerPoint. So you'll see as we move, there will be a box around what part of this left-hand bar we're taking a look at any given time. So this is just to show you the whole scope of the questions that we asked and to show you how they lined up with your questions. So right here on the right-hand side, you can see that your letter asked one question, which was related to what performance indicators should the index include. We actually broke that out into 3 much more specific questions, including what we call here question 1, gap closing options. Question 2 is career and college readiness options. And question 3 is looking at improvement as a performance indicator. Question 4 relates directly to your letter, question 2, which is what kind of weighting should the various tests have in our index. Question 5 here is about subgroup options, which we started to explore at our last board meeting. And question 6 was some feedback for those people who were aware of the current index and how it works, what we would want to keep or change in order to build on the success of the current index. In every case, we showed the AAW members what the current index looks like to ground them in it. We didn't assume they knew how it worked or what it looked like. But for this presentation, we've removed most of those slides. And then just for clarity, I want to point out the top green box here, proficiency. We pointed out that although there are questions related eventually to the weighting for proficiency and that sort of thing, we wanted to be clear that some decisions had already been made, both because they were already in the original index and they're articulated in the ESDA flexibility application. For example, that the index would not be limited just to reading and math, but that it would also include writing and science. So we thought it would be helpful for the AAW to hear that that was a decision that had been made, and also that there's a commitment to measuring growth for reading and math. Thanks, Aaron. So question 1, we'll dive right in. Obviously, closing opportunity and achievement gaps is critical in our education system, critical to the state board. And for example, board members have been very clear that we want to build upon the current index and look at ways to include things like English language learner data, et cetera. So we posed these as possible options to the AAW. So option A is that the index would really look at gaps among subgroups in terms of growth. So to what degree are kids making adequate growth? To what degree are subgroups of students out of school growing? The rationale here is that growth would be a leading indicator. Schools have lots of kids who are entering the system far behind, and so growth in many ways is a fairer look at school performance. Option B would be proficiency gaps, which is what we can see now when we compare different subgroup performance. It's what Emily showed you and focused on at our last board meeting, and that's how we're used to looking at gaps. It is a lagging indicator in that it's the outcome of students who are behind catching up or not, but it's also the ultimate goal of our system to close proficiency gaps, so it has a lot of value that way. And then choice C would be that we would maybe want to include both in our index. It's a lot more information, it's a deeper look at what's happening in a school, but it also adds a layer of complexity and makes it more difficult for stakeholders to understand. And then D, we included an other choice in every case so that the AAW could say, hey, you forgot one, and here's what we think, and to leave that open. So on this next slide, you can see a solid yellow bar here, which says that the feedback, and I want to take a second to explain how this worked. The feedback was collected in a couple different ways. At lunchtime, people were asked to place a colored dot on the option that they felt most resonated with them. And then we had small group discussion, as Aaron said, large group discussion, and at the end of the day, we had a separate set of charts for people to put a dot, again, same set of charts, but put a different colored dot on a different chart to say, okay, after having time to discuss this and think about it, here's how I feel about it now. It was anonymous, it wasn't a vote. It was just for us to get a sense of where the group as a whole was landing, and it was very helpful. In this case, every dot landed in that second wave on including both in our index. So question 2, again, related to performance indicators, is pretty straightforward. The option A is we do the minimum that the Department of Education requires, which is we look at high school graduation rates, and we make an assumption that good graduation rates means kids are ready for what comes after 12th grade for them. Option B would be that we include high school graduation rates and add some sub-indicators of both career and college readiness. And I restated to the AAW that this board cares about both pathways, multiple pathways, and that we would look at ways, if they like this option, we'd look at ways to include both things. So it's very transparent about that. And then C would be something else that we hadn't thought of. So here we had a unanimous response once again. No one put a dot on high school graduation rates only. That was very clear feedback. And then next slide is just a little bit of so you could see a snapshot of what we shared with them, which is that these would be possible sub-indicators. We're trying here to say we do have both college data and career readiness data. Obviously, there's always room for improvement in our data systems, but these would be some things that we might want to look at if we went with that option. And then question 3, I did leave a couple background slides in for you on this one because we found that the more we talked about it, the more confusing it became for our group. The concept of improvement is looking at students in a building in a given year compared to students in the building the year before. And so it's basically the best we could do in terms of was the building improving over time in the past. So the current index not only has improvement, but it also looks at improvement from a learning index framework where schools get increasing amounts of points, essentially, for having kids be not just proficient, but highly proficient. So rather than just scoring a level 3 and counting everyone over that bar as proficient, looking at kids who are level 4 and giving basically bonus points for that. Conversely, for students who are not yet proficient, if a lot of them are at level 2 versus level 1, that school would score higher. So we wanted to introduce this concept to the AAW and explain it a little bit. We can skip this slide. This is just to explain the scoring. So these are the choices as we laid them out. Option A is looking at simply improvement from the prior year in the number of students meeting standards. So 60% of kids meet standards this year. Last year, 55% of kids met standards. The school has improved in the percent of students meeting standards. The positive here is straightforward, easy to understand, but the problem is that this is basically a proxy for whether schools are improving or not, and it's confusing sometimes because districts go through school boundary changes, so they can get entirely different populations of school, or they may have different magnet programs that really significantly change their student population from one year to the next. So these are different groups of kids each year. Option B is still looking at improvement, but looking at growth instead of percent of kids meeting standards. So same challenge in that they can be different kids, but at least you're looking at the growth of kids from a previous year to the current year. So it's a little bit fairer, but it really has some of the same challenges to validity. C is exactly what we do now, similar to A, but with the addition of a learning index, so looking at the nuances of not just who's above, who's below, but what's the distribution above and below standards. It's more difficult to understand. It's challenging for people to understand that. But it does put an emphasis on all students matter being important, rather than just kids that are just below proficient and focusing on getting them up over the bar, moving all kids' performance up. D would be none of the above. The thinking here is that now that we have student growth, improvement may be unnecessary or redundant. And then E is other, and we ended up filling this one in the course of the day to say improvement in an overall index score could result in some kind of recognition. So rather than adding improvement into the index and adding points or taking points away, as we do now, simply saying, okay, you scored better on the index this year than you did last year, and therefore we're going to make you eligible for a reward or a recognition. So this was confusing enough for the group that we thought we'd embed a few examples here. So option A is improvement from the prior year and the percent of kids meeting standards. So this is what we're used to looking at. Last year, in 2011, 65% of students met standards. This year, 70% of students met standards. They may be entirely different students, but more of them met standards this year than last, and so we would say this school has improved. Option B is a little more complex, so I hope it's showing up okay on your screen. This is an example I've taken from schoolview.org, which has the growth model data on it. These happen to be Colorado examples, but I just pulled this up because we don't have Washington examples readily available. You can see that Bruce Randolph School had observed growth, which would be median growth, of 32 one year and 46 the next year. So you could say this school, students in this school grew more this year than they did grow last year. So that's looking at improvement through growth. And then option C, again, was using a learning index. So this is just here to illustrate that not all schools with the same absolute level of student performance are the same. So in both of these schools, this is one school from one year to the next. So the school actually still had 60% of kids at standard in 2011, 60% of kids at standard in 2012. But 2012 is a better picture because more of those kids are scoring in a level 4 than a level 3, and more of them are scoring in a level 2 than a level 1. And so we found here that, and this slide may not be in your, if you've printed this out, it may not be in what you have, but essentially it's the same set of choices for improvement with a pale yellow look here. So there was quite a spread in the amount of bubbles or dots on each choice. I would say people tended to prefer the more nuanced look of using a learning index. They preferred growth in terms of growth versus just proficiency. Some dots landed on none of the above, and some dots landed on improvement only for the purposes of recognition. So pretty mixed input here. So moving on to question 4, which is about weighting. We did a little bit of sharing of how the assessment system is currently looked. So this is just to show that reading and math are tested every year, 3 through 8, and once in high school, or sometimes twice in high school. And writing and science are tested less often. The current index places basically equal value on all of those subjects by just saying whatever you have tested in your school gets equally calculated along with everything else. So just because science is only tested once in an elementary school doesn't mean it's not as important as reading or math. So, pretty straightforward question. Option A would be, in the new index, we should have equal weight for all tested subjects. And the positive to that is that it values science and writing equally, regardless of how often it's tested, and it's really pretty easy to understand. Option B is to weight subjects based on testing frequency. We've had some concern raised that it's not fair to base 25% of a score on a test that's only given 12% of the time, for example. And it's a little more, this would be more difficult to understand, but we have had a little bit of suggestion that this would be fairer for schools. And then C would be other. We had an almost unanimous response to this, and quite frankly, not a whole lot of discussion. This was not hard for the AAW to weigh in on, which is to say that option A was the preferred choice. I say near unanimous because we had a few dots on other, and we're not certain what that meant, but we didn't have anyone preferring to do some kind of complicated calculation based on how often things are tested. So it really validates what the index is already doing. Question 5 was very complex to wrestle with. And of course, I want to point out that subgroups themselves are not a performance indicator. This is sort of a layer on the entire accountability system. So you can look at subgroups within proficiency and within growth, which is what the AAW recommended. You can also look at subgroups in terms of career and college readiness. So this is sort of a broad, open-ended question. What's the best way to look at subgroups regardless of how you're applying that information? Option A is what we do now, the federal subgroups, which you can see over here on the right-hand side of your screen. These are the way student groups are segregated now for both AMOs and prior to that for AYPs. Option B would be to continue with that, but also create some new subgroups. We talked at the last board meeting about the difficulty in measuring English language learner performance because as soon as students are English proficient and therefore well able to take an English language test, they actually leave the subgroup and just go into the all students subgroup. So would we want to create a subgroup of former ELL students to make sure that those students are doing well? We know they struggle tremendously as a group, so would we want to monitor that and pay special attention? Would we want to create a category of catch-up students? So regardless of what race or ethnic group you're in, or whether you're low income or not, if you're below grade level, you could land in a catch-up student group. And some states have taken a lowest 25% approach to say, even where we have invisible subgroups because N sizes are low, we always have a lowest quartile in school. So we'll always look at the lowest quartile compared to everyone else. So that's a very conceptual option, but there it is. And then C would be to create super subgroups for schools with low N size. So you could keep all the normal federal subgroups, and you could say, well, for very small schools or schools that are not diverse at all, you could create kind of a super subgroup of kids at risk and compare that super subgroup to everyone else in the school in order to make as many kids visible as possible in our system. D would be some other combination. And E is actually would be both B and C because they're not mutually exclusive options. You could both add new subgroups and create super subgroups for small schools. So here we had some, not surprisingly, some pretty mixed responses. The dots tend to land on B, D, which is other, and E, which is both B and C. So Ben's going to talk about this a little bit more in his presentation, but some of the comments under other were about dissatisfaction with the current level of disaggregation. So wishing, for example, to be able to disaggregate recent East African immigrants from African Americans who've been in this country for generations, for example, or wanting to be able to see in an index, recent Russian immigrant populations versus other groups. And so the current data system doesn't necessarily support that approach. So it was pushing on the, not so much on an index conversation, but on a subgroup and data collection issue. And then both B and C, to say, again, those aren't mutually exclusive, but let's both keep normal subgroups, add some new ones that we feel compelled to add. And one of the participants suggested former special ed students, the same idea with former ELL. So the purpose of special education is to make sure students are at standard and give extra targeted instruction to that end. Then we should have some students exiting that subgroup when we create a new subgroup to make sure they're doing well as well. And then a lot of interest in the super subgroup for schools with invisible gaps. So pretty mixed response on that one. And then finally, question 6 was, what should we keep or change in the current index? So what we did at lunch was have people gravitate toward whatever topic they wished of these questions. This was one of them, and we said, if you know the index and you're pretty familiar with it and you want to give us some input about what to keep or what we might need to change, please do so. We didn't have it as a large group discussion because there wasn't necessarily a deep understanding of the current index in this group. So this is the feedback that we got, but doesn't necessarily represent consensus from the group. But we had a couple comments. One is to think about using tier labels that are more accessible to parents than numbers. So rather than 1 through 7, something else that's more meaningful, or rather than exemplary to struggling. And then the second comment was to build upon the new online format that we have with some more tools, add in more data, and roll it up into the OSPI report card. So I'm going to pause at this time to answer some questions. I think we are quite ahead of schedule. So we'll take a look here and see if you put any questions in your chat window.
And at this point, let's keep the questions about just if they understand the options that have been laid out to them, and we'll save the questions about what we're going to do for the second round.
Do the options make sense? Do I make the AAW input clear? And we're not seeing, oh, we have a question. So, yes, so there's a question regarding high school graduation rates. Is this referring to four-year only grad rate or include extended years? So there was a little bit of conversation about that. What the ESEA flexibility application says is 5 years. That's what OSPI uses now. We're, I think, in a minority of states that are allowed to do that. But there was brief conversation about, well, should we look at 6 or 7 or 8 years? That's challenging from a data perspective, but I don't think it's off the table by any means. So there was brief discussion about that, but we didn't focus on it. How difficult will it be for districts to collect the required data for questions 5, B, and C? So, from my perspective, I don't think it's difficult, and I think it's something that can be accomplished in the current system. So the 5B and C is about new subgroups. So we already know in our data system who is at standard. So those would be catch-up students. We already know who's former ELL because they used to be flagged as ELL. So those are data we already have. This is part of why we have a technical working group. So we could ask districts, hey, what challenges would this pose to that we haven't thought through? I threw those out there as things that could be accomplished in our existing system. They're mostly calculations that would happen on the OSPI side rather than in district.
No other questions?
Okay, no other questions.
Okay. So if there are no other questions, let's move on to what a November motion might look like and what a staff recommendation might be at this point. I'd ask you to focus on the questions that Aaron has flashed up on the screen here, because that really is the goal for today. You're not taking action today, but you're preparing yourself, in a sense, for what additional information you need or what clarity you might require. Okay, so before I get into the specific recommendation areas, I'm going to give you an executive summary. What I would say is that there were certain areas where there was pretty clear consensus, but there were 2 areas where there was not clear consensus. And at this point, the staff recommendation is going to reflect that it would be consistent with those areas where there was group consensus. In the 2 areas where there weren't, and we'll go over those, I think one of them deserves additional research and attention, that being the issue of disaggregation of subgroups. But one of them I don't believe is, and that is the issue of improvement. So now I'm going to go through each one of those. Okay, we'll start with gap closing. As Sarah indicated, it was unanimous, as I recall, for the inclusion of both proficiency and growth gaps. And I think staff concurs with that sentiment. I think the idea here is that proficiency gaps and growth gaps are conceptually different things, and they're each important. So we are concerned about a school that has large gaps in the percentage of students that are reaching proficiency that may not have large growth gaps, or the inverse could also be true. I think of the 2, I would say that growth gaps is probably of paramount importance, but I think what we're addressing here is that we want both types of gaps reflected in the index. And so in that respect, the staff recommendation would essentially align with the consensus that emerged out of the discussion last week. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Current college readiness. So, this is a tricky question to sequence because obviously the first thing out of people's mouths is, well, sure, we'll do something beyond graduation rates, but what would that be? But in order to get to that what would that be question, you kind of have to make a high-level policy decision about whether you want kind of a minimalist approach, which is just to use high school graduation rates, or something more. Pretty clear consensus, oh actually I think this one was also unanimous, that we would want to go into some greater depth. We didn't ask the AAW at this meeting, but will at the next meeting, if the board agrees that that's a question they want to ask the group, what those sub-indicators would be. But at this point, we're saying we are interested in something more nuanced than just a high school graduation rate as the college and career readiness indicator. So again, the staff recommendation aligning with the input of the AAW. Okay. So earlier I was saying there was two areas where there was not emerged consensus. One which I thought deserved further inquiry, and one which I think does not. The discussion at the AAW meeting as it related to improvement was a challenging one because it's complicated. We tend to conflate the concept of improvement with the concept of growth. And I think we constantly have to be reminding ourselves that understandability and transparency has to be a big part of this process. And we had a room full of pretty sophisticated, very sophisticated folks actually, many who brought a ton of knowledge to the table. And so this issue of confusion about the relationship between improvement and growth causes staff to go, okay, well, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to have both improvement and growth if we are constantly going to be battling this issue of complexity and understandability? And my view is that it's not worth it. My view is that we had an index that incorporated improvement over time because that's what we had at the time. We did not have student growth data available to us at that time. And I really feel like in most respects, the availability of student growth data addresses some of the same issues we were trying to get at, however crudely, by incorporating improvement over the time. I will say this, however, that I think the staff recommendation at this point would be, because there's no clear consensus and because for the reasons I just stated, I think it works against us in terms of some simplicity and being able to explain this to a broad group of stakeholders. I don't think improvement should be in the index itself, but I do think that improvement can be utilized effectively here. A couple different possibilities. One would be, what if improvement is not part of the underlying index score, but every April we give out an award to districts who have the largest increase in their composite index score. Okay, so we recognize it, but we keep it distinct from the underlying calculations of the index itself. Okay. Another thing to think about is in the current structure of RADs, required action districts, the superintendent of public instruction starts with a list of PLA schools, but then considers trend data in the selection of schools from that list. And perhaps improvement over time or trend data over time for the composite index could be used in a similar manner. Again, not part of the index, but another consideration that could be used in the superintendent's recommendation of schools in need of assistance. So my recommendation at this point, I should say staff recommendation at this point, is I think if we try to incorporate both improvement and growth in the model, we're going to be fighting that issue of understandability and complexity, and ultimately we're not adding a ton of value if we include it in the index as well. So high risk, relatively low reward, I think is the way I would characterize that. Next, on the issue of weighting of tested subjects, this again I think was unanimous. I think on the first one we had one other and then the other disappeared. I think what the way I would interpret the message that came out is people aren't really interested in some kind of complicated scheme of calculation that reflects the fact that, I think if I'm reiterating what Sarah said, science being tested once in an elementary school, so therefore it's, 13.2% relative to English that's tested 3 times as often. I think that the sentiment was value the subjects equally, irrespective of the frequency of testing. And so we concur with that. And then here is an area, okay, so we went over one area earlier with improvement where there was not a clear consensus, but we're comfortable making a recommendation. Here's an area where there wasn't a lot of consensus, but I actually think, and this is just kind of part of going through this process, we actually think that we might be able to create some options that are a combo option of some of the existing options that might garner more support. It became clear as we poured over this issue for quite some time in small and large groups that these are not completely mutually exclusive options. And so our recommendation, part of the sequencing of this is that we had identified the treatment of ELL students and the issue of language proficiency and how quickly you include their data into the second AAW meeting. And yet much of the comment that we got about subgroups was about that very issue. So we think we could come back with some comprehensive packages, both that reflect specific strategies for ELL, but also reflect some strategies for addressing this N size issue. And I think what Sarah captured earlier is the central tension here, which is lots of people want to disaggregate because they want to expose achievement gaps, right? That is, or opportunity gaps, if you will. But the countervailing tension there is, all right, well, if you disaggregate to the maximum extent, you might lose a lot of kids in the context of the index because you would have schools that don't hit the N size threshold. So there are other states that are developing strategies where, for example, you create super subgroups only when you need to in schools where the N size issue emerges for a particular group. So you don't create super subgroups kind of as a general statewide proposition, but if you have, and it depends on the size of the school and everything else, but you have a handful of districts where, American Indian and Black students fall below the N size. Only for those schools might you create perhaps an at-risk category so that they are included in the index, not excluded or not left behind, if you will, for the parlance. So I think the message is here, I think that we could come back with a different set of options that might get a better clustering of dot votes, if you will. I won't call them votes, but get a little bit better consensus. And so I am going to recommend that we not make a recommendation on subgroups at the November meeting as part of the motion. Okay? Okay. So at this point, we're going to take a 5-minute break, let people digest what has been given to them. Aaron, are they typing in their questions? Or are they going to be able to?
No, they're going to be on the phone.
Okay.
And we're going to start again at 11:50.
Okay. So at 11:50, you don't have to type in your questions at this point. At 11:50, we will come back together. And really the goal for the next segment is let's get you ready for a motion in November that you're all comfortable with. You feel like you have the information that you need. There's some great staff work going on this, and we want to make sure that it's responsive to what you need. The outcome we don't want is to show up to November and have any board members feeling like they didn't have the information they needed to take a thoughtful vote on the motion. Okay, so we'll see you at what time, Aaron?
11:50.
11:50.
5:30. Jim.
And in one piece, I'm writing in this area, writing a court letter responding to myself or something, to Arnie Duncan. That makes it fun. I don't know, it's funny.
Okay, welcome back. We're going to now go into the discussion part of the board meeting. Board members are going to... If there's background noise, we might have to mute for this. Just type in your questions. And in fact, we're going to start with a couple typed questions that we'll read aloud for the good of the group.
Yeah, one question was about the comment I think that sparked it was the how to improve upon the existing index. The question was, well, how would tier levels or tier labels be, how would they correspond to the priority and focus list? And I guess I would say that's still up in the air. That's something that most states in their ESDA flexibility applications how their tier labels lined up with those groups, and the intent here is that the index could help generate those lists as well as reward. But we don't have an answer for that at this time. It's something that would need to be decided. There's another question. How would data for proficiency and growth gaps be reflected and explained? So how it's reflected, I think that's both a question about how it would be displayed in the index and also maybe what impact it would have, so what relative weight. And I think that's a great question. We don't have answers yet. It's certainly something that would need to be worked out. How it would be explained, I have to say I think we have a big learning curve as a state in terms of understanding growth and student growth percentiles, and developing common vocabulary on that is going to be an ongoing challenge. So OSPI has actually hired a new staff person dedicated just to working with student growth data, and so we will be, in support of whatever kind of rollout strategy OSPI has around student growth, because it goes above and beyond just what's included in the index. So those are great questions. Another question is, we need good definitions about what is reflected in improvement and what is reflected. Why is Ben recommending not having both?
So,
Go back to the slides.
yeah.
So we'll
And
go
that
back
feedback we're
to.
getting, is there any way to,
Emily's working on it.
I assume it doesn't interfere with their ability to hear me.
I don't think so.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go back to the slide that I think Member Frank is referring to.
They're not big. Your paper.
It's going to be this one, 12, slide 12, right?
Slide.
12.
Yeah.
This one kind of improvement.
Okay, so Bunker, we think you're referring to slides 12 and 13, and then to my rationale. So, let's see. I think, well, let me say first of all that the reason why I would not recommend having both improvement and growth is partly because of your question, which is a good one, and the question that was asked multiple times at the AAW meeting and would be asked all the time. Because it is a difficult concept to delineate for folks, and then so if it is a difficult concept, is it worth it? Are we, is it so important to have both that the index wouldn't be valuable if it didn't have both? Okay, so improvement is not looking at the same groups of kids, but looking at different groups of kids. Okay, you have a school. It has a third grade. That third grade scored. Looking at Sarah's example page here, 65% in third grade in 2011. Next year comes around, same school, same grade, different kids, okay? So the next year, that different set of kids in the same grade in the same school scored 70%, okay? That school, quote unquote, improved in the way that we have traditionally defined improvement, okay? Now, and Sarah's going to interject.
So we actually had a school, I think last year or the year before, call us to say, you've named us to get this improvement award and recognition for improvement, and we would like you to take us off the list because we didn't actually improve necessarily at all. We have entirely different kids, and we now house the district's gifted program. So they did not want the recognition. They didn't think it was valid, and that is probably a rare phone call that we get. I think schools deserve more recognition than they get, and so they're probably happy to take it when it comes. But what you have is an issue of you could have some of the same kids or none of the same kids in that group. So the cohort of kids moving through, you're always getting new kids on the early end, losing kids on the older end as they either graduate or go to the middle school, for example, and then changing boundaries. And it was a very rough way, it was all we had at the time, a very rough way of trying to look at, has the school quality, the quality of the instruction, and the outcomes for kids, has it improved this year versus last year? It was pretty rough.
Mm-hmm. So that's in reference to Bunker slide 12. Okay? Different kids, same school, same grade. Okay? Now slide 13. Okay? Same kids. Okay, you're following the same kids over a period of time. Okay? And you're measuring the growth of those kids. And you're not comparing different cohorts of kids. All right? That is growth. The previous slide is improvement in the way we've classically defined it in the index, the existing index. Okay? So the reason that I wouldn't recommend that both be included is because I think that slide 13 and what slide 13 is meant to captures most of what we had intended to capture when we adopted the methodology in slide 12 in the original index. And I'm speaking in generalities here, but because this is not exactly the methodology of the current index. But the idea here is, why did we look at improvement in the first place? Why did we compare different cohorts of kids across years? And I think the reason, I wasn't here when that discussion happened, but intuitively, you wanted to get at this idea that schools are starting at different places. They have different kids. They have different obstacles. All right. So even if schools aren't necessarily performing at the higher echelons of 80 and 90% proficiency, if they've got a trajectory line that's going up, let's recognize that. Well, I think slide 13 and the methodology of growth kind of does the same thing in a way, because as Richard Wenning has repeatedly showed us, all kids can grow and all schools can grow. And it takes under account, in most every respect, those same obstacles. And your growth is not correlated to whether you're a high-performing or low-performing school, at least in Colorado. And so it kind of creates the equal playing field that we had hoped originally the methodology in slide 12 would do. And I think we got to face up to the fact that developing an index is one of those things where you make all these individual decisions, and then you get at the end and you realize, how did we create something so complicated? And I'm just trying to say at the front end that this is one area where we can eliminate confusion and complication and make it a whole lot easier to explain when we don't continually have to make the distinction between growth and improvement, when frankly, improvement in the new environment isn't all that important anyway. That is my opinion.
Can I add? So I just want to add a thought to that, which is that option B, which is up here, it wasn't should we have growth or not. That wasn't really the option. Growth would already be in the index because it's important data, it's new data, it's looking at the same kids over time versus different snapshots of kids. But what this option would be about would be adding more points for having better growth. So what the current index has is, if you get a certain percent of kids meeting standard, you might get, say, a 4 on a 7-point scale. If the next year you have more kids meeting standard, well, then you get a 5. So your performance is already recognized. You're going up. You get an extra point there. It's going to improve your overall index score. Currently, we also add improvement. So that inflates that improvement even more. So not only do you get the credit for having more kids proficient, but you also get like extra credit piled on top. So it's redundant in a way. Similarly, it really hurts schools when they go down a little bit, so their overall performance looks lower, and then they get a really low improvement score because they've dropped a little. So what it does is it just amplifies everything that's happening in both directions. And so this option B is intended to say, okay, we'd give a school extra points above and beyond whatever they get for growth, simply for having better growth. And I would argue that it's redundant and it's already included.
I hope that answers your question, Bunker.
So why don't we go, we're going to go through a few more typed in questions and make sure we have those covered before we open it up.
Can we get the background noise thing taken care of? It sounds like
We're working on it.
Okay, so we have a question that I actually like. I think it came from Connie. Connie, if you could restate your question differently. It says, go over your thinking on growth one more time. So I'm not sure if that's related to growth in the context of the improvement question or growth overall. So Connie, I'm sorry, if you wouldn't mind trying to reword that a little bit so we can really respond to the question, that would be helpful.
Oh, it looks like Connie did come in at the end there.
Okay, Connie, maybe you already have done that, so thank you. So there's a question about growth. Do we miss seeing anything in a particular class or teachers' classroom improvements by only following the growth of the third graders from third to fourth grade? Maybe, Bunker, if you could maybe give us an example to illustrate what the question
Might be
is.
talking about the frequency. I don't.
Should we be talking about what the focus is on the kids' growth, or is it on the teachers' capacity to create improvement?
Bunker, are you there?
Bless.
Bunker, you're unmuted, so if you're on the phone, you can talk.
Okay, we're not hearing you, so if you would like to type that question in.
Other questions? So I think, where I see the November motion is you're going to be asked to move forward on some questions where there's some pretty clear consensus. That's the first part, okay, at least in the AAW. And then you've got these two areas to deal with where there wasn't clear consensus, right? One was the subgroups, and the other was improvement, okay? And in those two areas, you've got a staff recommendation on one, and you don't have a staff recommendation on the other. On the issue of subgroups, we think if we take another bite at the apple, as it were, and put together a new package, we might be able to get a pretty good, I don't know that we're ever going to get complete unanimity. I mean, I was surprised that a couple of these got complete unanimity. But after all that discussion, we think we can refine an option that might get the group closer. But on improvement, I just think if we do that, if we keep going back and discussing it, it's never really going to resolve the fundamental issue for me, which is it's going to be a lot of complexity for not a lot of value add. That's kind of where I'm at on that. And that essentially summarizes the recommendation. Good new question.
Okay, we have a question from Bunker. So these are measurements only of growth or improvement from September to June, or whenever the test results are returned, but absent a September test, no baseline, right? And I'll tackle that one. At this point, the state testing system is only once per year, and it's in spring, and that's the information that we currently have. We don't have September baseline scores, and we don't have fall to spring, at least at the state level.
Right.
Some districts do have that, and some districts are already looking at growth on those measures locally, and we support that, but that doesn't seem like something we could roll into a statewide index at this time.
Yeah. Bunker, I know you have asked that question a couple times, and I have tried to look into that. And I haven't found an example where a state, using a state standardized system is able to do a state index that incorporates multiple assessment points within the year. If there is an example of which I am unfamiliar, please bring it to my attention, but I'm not aware of such an example.
There was one state, I can't name it off the top of my head, that used the NOEA map testing, which is a fall, winter, spring test, but they use that statewide.
That's what they require it and fund it statewide.
They require it. I presume there's a law that says districts have to do testing 3 times a year instead of once.
Right.
So one of the underlying assumptions we have here is that we need to get this done before June. We need to work within the existing system. And if there are other things that we need to table for future iterations of the index to think about for the future, we certainly could do that.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions? Okay. I'm going to ask this question. Is there anybody on the call who's a board member who is not right now comfortable coming to the November meeting and voting on a motion that reflects the recommendations that we have laid out. If you are uncomfortable, please indicate that you are and what additional information you need.
And if you are on the phone, you should be able to talk.
You want to roll through the board members and ask each individual?
Feedback. Kevin said he's fine.
Kevin's good to go. Anybody else?
Dan, I have a question. This is Amy.
Hi, Amy.
Hi. I have a question on the subgroups. Tell me,
Okay.
just a clarification question, what is 2 or more races? What's that mean?
2 or more races is, Amy, anytime a student self-identifies as being in more than one race category. So 2 or more races is a pretty diverse category by definition. But if a student says they are, for example, white and Native American, then they go into the 2 or more races category.
What's interesting about that, Amy, I don't know if you remember, but at the last board meeting we had a presentation by Linda that revealed that the 2 or more races category is the fastest growing category.
Right.
And one wonders, if we continue to apply a racial lens to the achievement gap issue, and we're talking now 20, 30 years, if 2 or more races becomes an ever increasingly dominant group, which would actually be kind of a nice thing in a way. Actually, it would be a nice thing. Racial subgroups might be a real challenge in a generation from now, in a kind of a good way, I think. It might be just one big muddled mess.
So, and this is Sarah.
It's a good thing.
Further confusion, this is a pretty imperfect system, but it's what we have. If a student self-identifies as Hispanic, then they are put into the data system, this is per federal rule, as Hispanic. So you can be Hispanic and Native American, and you're Hispanic as it gets rolled up to the feds. And that's their distinction. That's aligned with the census distinction. And so it doesn't always match what we think about at the local level. So it's sort of Hispanic, yes or no. If you're yes, you're Hispanic. If it's no, you can be from one race or multiple races.
So with our index, though, we don't have to follow these subgroups, right? We can. Do we have that option? Because that seems to be the question. Am I correct on that? That we can, for example, we could take that out?
So take it out and have a super subgroup approach?
Right.
We can, as long as we explain why and that it's a justifiable reason. So most of the state applications that have done this successfully have said that they're creating a super subgroup because they're missing a bunch of kids. Idaho kind of stands out to me in my memory of reading a lot of these, in that they don't have a lot of racial diversity. Where they do have kids of color in their schools, they tend to be too few to show up. So they created a super subgroup because they're able to include more kids and make gaps more transparent by doing that.
Right, okay.
We have heard unofficially that some states are now being asked to further disaggregate, even though they got approved to have, for example, a quote-unquote minority subgroup. So it seems like it's a changing landscape. And I think there are several arguments states put forward about it. One is that if you look at the federal subgroups that we listed here, you can be in multiple groups. You can be low income, you can be an English learner, you can belong to one or more race categories, and you can have a disability, and then you're also in all categories. So whether you're a low-performing student or high-performing student, you're counted multiple times.
Right.
So some states are trying to solve that problem with super subgroups as well. I don't know that the department really embraces that as a big problem, but what does seem to be a compelling argument is we can demonstrate, some states can demonstrate they can include more schools in their gap measures by creating super subgroups. That seems to be the reason that gets accepted.
Okay, I understand. My concern originally was just that they are counted, a child could be counted in a number of the subgroups, and so I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Yep.
And I think another theme that emerged in the AAW, I think I just said 3 A's, 2 A's, AAW discussion was this distinction between, like sometimes you talk about super subgroups, you think, oh, well, we won't be able to see the data. And we're making a distinction between disaggregation for the purposes of scoring the index. Because one way or another, we have to make the data available in these federal categories. So it is an issue of like burying the data or not being able to see the achievement gaps or not being able to, not having that data for purposes of analysis. It's really an index scoring methodology issue.
Thanks, I understand.
Okay. Any other questions?
Bob has a question. How do you compensate for changes in the testing methodology or test instruments between 2 consecutive years?
So I wonder if that's a vertical alignment issue.
Yeah, I think it's a huge question.
I didn't understand the second part. So they say, how do you compensate for changes in the testing methodology or test instruments? So I think I get the test instruments piece.
Mm-hmm. And I would add, when standards change, that's another variable that will change from year to year.
Yeah.
So we saw, I think here's an illustrative example. We switched to an EOC, and we no longer have a comprehensive test. We see different results. Bob, is that you on the line?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of feedback, so I'm just typing in questions.
Oh, okay. We can hear you pretty well if you want to talk.
No, like we switched from handwritten tests to computer tests. When New Balance comes out, they're talking about combining reading and writing all in one test instead of 2 separate. How do you maintain a growth comparison when the methodology and the tests and so on are constantly changing?
Actually, I think growth is the best thing when everything is changing because you're comparing a student's performance to other similar students with a similar performance history. It's things like proficiency, just simple percent of kids meeting standards that I think will change more than growth. Growth helps you transition through those things because you still have a percentile compared to all the other kids versus a whole new test. So there's a lot of anxiety about if we switch to SBAC and it's more, the rigor is more like a NAEP, what happens when everyone's performance in the state goes down, if that's what happens.
I just wonder, will there be a chance to see maybe a mock-up or some simulated data as to what this thing might look like at the November meeting?
Not at the November meeting, Bob, but the way this thing is structured is we've tried to sequence the questions in such a way that within, let's see, it would be after the November, December, January board meeting, we will have enough of the foundational questions answered that we can simulate some data so that people can see what the data looks like, respond to it, ask further questions. So not in November, but perhaps as early as late January, early February is the way we've scheduled it, because they don't know what to simulate until we've made some basic decisions. But Bob, I think the growth methodology that Richard Wenning presented to us, the SGP methodology, is tailored in such a way as to be able to derive growth measures across these differing tests. If we were to ever get a point where we have an SBAC, a smarter balanced system that supports vertical alignment across grades, that would avail multiple methodologies, but SGP methodology, the student growth percentile growth methodology, is one that works in either environment. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I can just see we're going to struggle with that issue, but we're not alone. Colorado would have the same problems.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other thing is, like, we're kind of at the precipice of some fairly significant assessment system changes. You know, I mean, it could go in a number of different directions, right? So we're trying to plan in such a manner where we can implement an index under multiple contingencies here. I mean, I assume that we're going to proceed with full SBAC assessment, but you know, the legislature can do a lot of things. You know, what is the relationship? You know, it's the discussion we've had at the board meeting, the relationship between the new SBAC and the end of course tests. What are you doing in 10th grade? Is there an 11th grade test? Do you collapse the current end of course or some of the HESB tests within subject in favor of an SBAC test? You know, there's a lot of different things that could happen that we don't know the answer to at this point. But I think we have the flexibility in the SGP methodology to respond to that. I hope that's responsive to your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just trying to point out that's something we need to struggle with.
Yeah, no, it's...
Yeah, districts are asking that question too.
You'll know when the question gets really hard where I have to turn to Sarah and have her answer.
So Bunker has another question. Did anyone happen to see the proposal that the Florida State Board put forth to establish a growth index based on having the current achievement gap for student groups and observe for growth from there instead of everyone reaching the same target? Another way to get where we're heading, question mark?
Growth having the current achievement gap. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's an AMO issue.
Right.
I think,
Right.
Bunker, you're probably referring to something similar to what Washington selected in the ESDA application, which is to set targets for closing proficiency gaps by half at every subgroup level. So I'm familiar with the Florida proposal, so I think that we're kind of headed in the same direction. One of the challenges Florida's had is that they've just switched to a very different test, and they saw their performance drop dramatically, which is, I think, part of what Bob was just referring to. And they also made the shift that we have committed to making, which is that they went from excluding English learner data for several years to including it, and they got some pushback on that. That was a compromise they made in order to get their flexibility waiver. And so we faced some of those same challenges.
So Bunker, the part of the work plan here is we had to figure out like the sequence of questions, and we have front-loaded the questions that we need to answer before we even start to build a model. We think that we can, the AMO question is sequenced in the third meeting because we can, once we get a model built, then we can start, well, an initial model built, what we're calling the prototype. The AMO crosswalk isn't necessarily dependent on how we build the model. So that is not a question you're going to be asked to take action on in November, but it's a really important question. I'll note that I was part of a work session at the LEAP conference in Seattle a couple weeks ago, in which there was a discussion about this. And there was some concern about setting different goals for different groups of kids. And we had a fairly lengthy discussion about that in terms of clarifying just exactly what is the issue. Because when you look at a graph that shows the achievement gaps being halved up until 2017, you can't necessarily conclude from that you're holding different standards for different groups of kids, because if you just simply extend that graph out, all kids do end up at the same point. Then it becomes an issue not that you have different standards for different kids, it's just how long are you going to allow or expect kids to all come together at a common goal? So part of it is how we depict that. Most of the graphs that you've seen in the PowerPoints reflect a 5-year portrayal, and it just shows that the gaps only get halved within 5 years. Really, the underlying policy question is how long do we expect all kids to meet the same goal?
Well, and just if we remember the choices that we faced when Washington submitted the application, choice A was just change the uniform bar goal to 2020, so just have everybody proficient, but just a little bit later. And that didn't seem to solve any of the inherent problems to No Child Left Behind. The second choice was, or another choice was, set a target of halving your proficiency gap by 2017, which seemed like a good direction to go. It recognizes where schools are now and was attempting to set ambitious but realistic targets. It does come with that challenge that it looks like we're setting lower targets for some kids than others, and that is a significant problem. And then the third choice was some other thing that the state proposes, and at that point we didn't have a some other thing. So I would argue that our index could become the some other thing, and then we could, and this would be OSPI's ultimate decision because they would submit the ESBA flexibility application in June, but I would argue that the index could substitute for AMOs entirely. So that's not a decision that's been made,
right,
but that's on the table as a possibility.
And not a decision we're going to ask you to make in November.
Right.
Other questions? Okay. Well, we're well ahead of agenda. So again, the goal of this is to have everybody comfortable going into November.